Anyone here from Lebanon? Okay, he explains that it was Israeli military operations that liberated Lebanon from the wrath of Hezbollah. And then if you have any doubt about what happened in Gaza during those 22 days, he explained that it was Israeli military operations that enabled Gaza residents to return to their daily routine. Well, thank you very much for that. The Israeli ambassador to the United States is a fellow named Michael Oren. Some people even think he's a historian. He said that the Goldstone report was even worse than Ahmadinejad and the Holocaust deniers, which is obviously pretty bad. Then back in the United States, Alan Dershowitz at Harvard Law School, he said the Goldstone report is so filled with lies, distortions, and blood libels that could have been drafted by Hamas extremists, that it recalled the protocols of the elders of Zion, and Goldstone was an evil man, an absolute traitor. As we know from Sinclair Lewis's novel Elmer Gantry, every circus needs a clown. So along came Elie Wiesel, and he called the Goldstone report a crime against the Jewish people. The interesting question is, what accounts for this hysterical reaction to the Goldstone report? Because after all, the Goldstone report was the last in a long series of reports that condemned Israeli crimes in Gaza. Amnesty International put out 2 very substantial reports. Human Rights Watch has put out 6 reports. And then there are the Palestinian human rights organizations, the Israeli human rights organizations, the independent international commissions, fact-finding missions. Why the Goldstone report? In fact, the Goldstone report was in many ways the most conservative and cautious of the reports. So why did Israel and its supporters go nearly berserk over its publication and continue to go berserk over its publication? Some of you may know that last week the South African Zionist Federation was trying to prevent Mr. Goldstone from attending his grandson's bar mitzvah in South Africa. So why this hysterical reaction? And the answer is really not too hard to find. Because Mr. Goldstone, he's not only Jewish, but he's also a self-declared Zionist. He said, I worked for Israel all of my adult life. I fully support Israel's right to exist. I am a firm believer in the absolute right of the Jewish people to have their home there. Mr. Goldstone sits on the board of governors of the Hebrew University in Jerusalem. He received his honorary doctorate from the Hebrew University in Jerusalem. His mother was an activist in the Zionist movement. His daughter emigrated to Israel. When Goldstone was asked why he became an international prosecutor, defender of human rights, he said it was because of the experience of the Nazi Holocaust. Now Israel had a real problem on its hands, because for decades it's honed, it's perfected these ideological weapons to neutralize any criticism of Israel, to discredit any critics of Israel. So if you criticize Israel, you must be an anti-Semite, or you must be a Holocaust denier, or you must be a self-hating Jew. And now, Mr. Goldstone, in his person, he neutralized all these weapons. Mr. Goldstone doesn't seem like your typical self-hating Jew. He doesn't seem like your typical anti-Semite. He says, I'm a Zionist, I love Israel. He doesn't seem like your typical Holocaust denier. He says, the Holocaust inspired me to become a prosecutor. As the Israeli columnist Gideon Levy put it, this time, meaning Goldstone, this time the messenger is propaganda proof. If Goldstone was not an anti-Semite, if he was not a self-hating Jew, if he wasn't a Holocaust denier, if he wasn't incompetent or a fool, and the chief prosecutor for war crimes in Yugoslavia and Rwanda hardly seems to be your typical incompetent or fool, then there could only be one explanation for the devastating content of the report that he authored. The report that said Israel's military and political leaders launched a deliberately disproportionate attack to punish, humiliate, and terrorize the civilian population. If he wasn't an anti-Semite, a self-hating Jew, or Holocaust denier, then the only plausible explanation for what he wrote in that report was that it was true. And for Israel, that was and continues to be a disaster. And for that reason, Israel did and continues to be in panic mode. There are a couple of significant consequences of the Gaza massacre and the Goldstone report, which we should all pay attention to. Goldstone, in many ways, is your typical classical liberal Jew. He's a renowned defender of the rule of law, and he's a defender of human rights. Jews are overwhelmingly like Mr. Goldstone. They're overwhelmingly liberal. That's just the nature of being Jewish in the modern world. And so we take, for example, the last presidential election, 80% of Jews voted for Barack Obama. Among Latinos, the vote was about 67%. Among whites in general, it was about 43%. The only ethnic group that voted in larger numbers for Obama than Jews was obviously African Americans. If you factor in income, Jews are by far and away the wealthiest ethnic group in the United States. They should be voting Republican, but Jews are liberal. They vote overwhelmingly Democrat. And what does liberal mean in the current context? It means supporting the rule of law, supporting international institutions, supporting human rights. Amnesty International, it's a liberal organization. Human Rights Watch, it's a liberal organization. Human rights organizations are liberal. And as Goldstone's own person illustrated, it's becoming more and more impossible for Jews who call themselves overwhelmingly liberals to defend Israel's conduct. Not least because it's human rights organizations, liberal human rights organizations, which are at the forefront condemning Israeli conduct. And so what you see now is the slow but sure breaking up of American Jewish support, or I should say uncritical American Jewish support for Israel. And that leads us to the last most important question, namely, what should we do? What should we do now? And here I think it's useful to take some inspiration and guidance from Mr. Gandhi, the Mahatma. I spent some time, about a year, going through his collected works, which are quite substantial. They run to about 100 volumes.